Howdy folks, Jeremy KF7IJZ here, back again with another battery comparison video. This time I have a third battery to introduce into the mix, and that is a Bioenno BLF-1208LB. So today I'm going to be comparing two lithium iron phosphate batteries to a traditional lead acid AGM battery. Starting with the lead acid AGM battery, this battery is rated at 9 amps, and this battery is brand new. I purchased it to refurbish a UPS I have and has not yet made it into the UPS. The second battery we're going to be looking at is the A123 Systems ALM-12V7. Now, we've looked at this battery in the past, and technically this battery is no longer manufactured under the A123 Systems brand. It's now branded NEC and comes with a blue top. Now, granted, this battery is a couple years old, but it has had less than 50 cycles on it total, so I feel like running it in the test is still a valid comparison against the other two batteries. The third battery we're going to be looking at, which is my newest lithium iron phosphate battery, is a Bioenno BLF-1208LB. Bioenno was a company that I met with Dayton this year and got to talking with them, and they were kind enough to provide me this BLF-1208LB for this comparison, as well as the charger that goes with it. In this video, I will cover quickly what my test setup was and what my methodology was, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time digging deep into the equipment or the software. I'm really going to spend more time looking at the data. But before we do that, let's take a closer look at the Bioenno BLF-1208LB. So again, I reached out to Bioenno because I was really interested in evaluating this battery against the other lithium iron phosphate battery packs I'd looked at in the past. Their prices were incredibly reasonable. The batteries looked like good quality. So they sent me this 8 amp hour rated BLF-1208LB. Now, Bioenno Power actually makes many different battery modules that are in these very nice ABS plastic cases, available in various ratings. From 8 amp hours, they have a 12, a 15, a 20, and so on. You can check that out at their website at bioennopower.com, which I will also have a link to in the show notes. For this, though, I felt like being right at that sweet spot of under $100, this was the perfect battery to evaluate. Now, they sent me the battery module itself, which sells for $95. They also included a 2 amp constant current charger designed specifically for their lithium iron phosphate batteries. This charger, if you want to buy it with the battery from them, makes the entire package at $107. So battery plus charger for $107 from their website directly. It's a really good deal. And if you're impatient, if I remember correctly, there were even better deals to be had at Dayton. Taking a quick look here at the user manual. Now, this is a PDF of the same thing that's included with the battery, but focusing really on the specifications at first. This battery is 6 inches by 2.6 inches by 3.6 inches in dimension. Of course, this is roughly the same size as your traditional 7 or 9 amp hour AGM battery pack. As I mentioned, the weight on this battery is 2.4 pounds, making it just under half the weight of a traditional 6-pound lead acid battery. As I mentioned, the nominal capacity for this battery is 8 amp hours, with a maximum charging voltage of 14.6 volts, a charging current of 2 amps, a voltage range of 10 volts on the low end and a 14.6 volts on the high end, a maximum continuous discharge current of 10 amps. So in speaking with Bioenno Power, they will tell you that this battery really is meant more for QRP or lower power operations. This is not meant to run a 100-watt HF radio off of. So this would be good for running a VHF, UHF type radio, maybe at medium power. It would also be good for running at maximum a high power HF rig at maybe 40, 50 watts, somewhere in that range. It can also handle a peak pulse current of up to 24 amps for up to 2 seconds. The operating temperature is negative 10 degrees Celsius to 60 degrees Celsius, and it has your traditional F-type fast-on tabs. Now, inside this battery, like most lithium iron phosphate battery packs that are in this caliber, just like in the A123/NEC pack, there is a circuit board that has some intelligence on it. The first job of the intelligence is the battery management system, or the BMS, which is responsible for balancing the cells in the lithium battery. This is common because you want to make sure that all the cells are charged to the same voltage or discharged to the same voltage to ensure that one cell in the pack doesn't ruin the overall battery. In addition to that, there are several protection items, including overcharge protection, over discharge protection, over current protection, and over temperature protection. A couple of other notes from the manual that are worth pointing out. First of all, on the charging front, I am using the supplied Bioenno charger, which is a 2 amp constant current charger that will switch to a constant voltage mode when the battery gets full. They point out that for this particular battery, the charging current should be around 2 amps. They also recommend fully charging the battery before its first use, and they say that a full charge will take between 3 and 5 hours with the supplied charger. The charger they provide has a single LED on it that will either show red or green. They point out that green does not mean complete. Green simply means that the charger has switched from constant current, which is the red LED color, to the constant voltage color. They also point out that this is a top balancing battery, so it needs to stay in that constant voltage mode for a while so that cell balancing can occur. On the discharge front, no really any surprises. This is a quote-unquote 12-volt battery. Maximum continuous discharge current is 10 amps, and that the battery outputs a steady voltage. So as we've talked in the past, lithium iron phosphate batteries have a fairly flat discharge curve. In this case, they say it'll stay around 12.8 volts, but we'll look at that a little bit later when we analyze the data. One other thing to point out is that for these particular batteries, they specifically call out that they do not recommend using them in series or parallel if you can just get a larger single battery. This is one area where the A123 batteries may have a slight advantage because their batteries are designed to be used in both series and parallel. They further state that these batteries will not work in series whatsoever, and so you should not try to. They point out that if you are going to parallel them, only connect batteries with equal state of charge in parallel, also measure the internal resistance of each battery, and use only batteries with closely matched internal resistance. Here's the charger provided by Bioenno, and it really doesn't look like anything special. It's approximately the size of a standard laptop power supply. On the right, you'll see the LED that will either light green for constant voltage or red for constant current mode. One thing significantly different about this charger from a laptop power supply, however, is the fact that it terminates to 2 alligator clips. These are small clips that are perfectly sized for attaching to the fast-on tabs on the battery itself. To conduct our discharge test, I'll be using my Yaesu M9712 programmable DC electronic load. This unit is capable of up to 300 watts of discharge with a voltage range of 0 to 150 volts. I will be connecting this to the computer and the software provided by Yaesu for data acquisition and capture, which will later be imported into Excel, which we'll show here in a moment. One thing to point out is the leads that I show in this particular image are not the leads I ended up using. I ended up terminating some 10-gauge wire with some heavy ring terminals and then terminated the other side with fast-on connectors to ensure there was a minimum voltage drop in the test line. These lines are smaller, and I did witness a significant voltage drop as I attempted my testing. The PC software connects via a USB to serial adapter that is optically isolated from the DC load. From inside the software, I have access to all of the readings that the machine is capable of making. I also have the ability to run battery tests based on a function that is built into the software. From in here, I can set up discharge tests to model single discharges, or as you can see on the right, I can actually set a series of tests that will vary the current as the tests run. My testing methodology will be as follows. I will immediately take each battery off its charger after having been on the charger for a while to ensure maximum charge. I will connect it to the Yaesu using approximately a 1-foot long section of 10-gauge heavy-duty wire terminated to heavy-duty ring terminals with fast-on tabs. I will then run a series of discharge tests, including a series of constant current tests, as well as a series of duty cycle tests to simulate certain operating conditions you might experience in the field. I will discharge every battery down to 11.8 volts. I've chosen this because this is approximately the negative 15% range, as many radios are given a voltage requirement of 13.8 volts, plus or minus 15%, which happens to be about like 11.78, so we chose 11.8. In the past, I have been criticized for not setting the cutoff voltage to be measured as the terminal voltage of the battery. Instead, the cutoff voltage is determined by the load itself. This most accurately reflects the conditions we would experience in the field, because the radio will be performing based on the voltage it receives at the far end of the line, not at the terminal voltage of the battery. Before we begin to take a look at the test data, let's just do a comparison of the published specifications for these batteries. Here I have the A123, the generic AGM, and the Bioenno battery. Their prices are $135 for the A123, $25 for the AGM, $95 for the Bioenno. The A123 is rated at 4.6 amp hours, the AGM is rated at 9, and the Bioenno is rated at 8. The A123 battery is 2 pounds, the AGM battery is 6 pounds, and the Bioenno battery is 2.4 pounds. Now next we have minimum cycles and maximum cycles, and these are really related to the overall lifetime usable capacity for the battery. I don't have exact published figures for these, but again, based on what you will generally find out there, I have created very liberal ranges, although Bioenno does actually claim in some of their literature that this is a 2000 cycle battery. Unfortunately, I just don't have the time to actually try to test this. The numbers that I have for the AGM battery have actually come from published specifications from the Duracell similar-sized AGM batteries. I feel like that's probably a pretty reliable guide. So for the A123 being a lithium iron phosphate, we would expect a minimum of 1,000 cycles. The AGM, we would expect a minimum of 100 cycles. And the Bioenno, again, being lithium iron phosphate, we would expect a minimum of 1,000 cycles. Again, a cycle is the charge-discharge cycle. For the A123 being lithium iron phosphate, we would expect a max of 2,000 cycles. Same for the Bioenno, and a max of up to 500 cycles for the AGM if you weren't fully discharging it. Now, based on those specifications, we can look at some interesting statistics. First of all, the price per rated amp hour. For the A123, that's $29 per amp hour. For the AGM, it's $3 per amp hour. And for the Bioenno, that's $12. And of course, that's not the total lifetime amp hour, right? That's just taking the price and dividing it by the rated amp hour. Here, we compare the rated amp hours of the battery to its weight. For the A123 battery, you get 2.3 amp hours per pound. For the AGM battery, you get 1.5 amp hours per pound. And for the Bioenno battery, you get 3 1/3 amp hours per pound. For the last two columns, we look at the total cost of an amp hour over the lifetime cycles. So in this column, we look at the minimum, and in this column, we look at the max. To calculate this, I take the total price of the battery, I divide it by the product of the amp hour rating by the number of cycles. And in either case, it's the minimum cycles or the maximum cycles. So for the A123 battery, we would expect 2.9 cents per amp hour over a 1,000 cycle life of the battery. For the AGM battery, we would expect a 2.8 cents per amp hour over the 100 cycles of the battery. And for the Bioenno, we would expect 1.2 cents per amp hour over the 1,000 cycles of the battery. On the max side, we would expect 1.5 cents for the A123 battery over the maximum 2,000 cycles. For the AGM, we would expect 0.6 cents for the maximum of 500 cycles. And for the Bioenno, we would expect 0.6 cents for the maximum 2,000 cycles. The first test that I ran on these batteries was a 10 amp constant current discharge test. I started with this test because 10 amps is the maximum rated discharge current for both the A123 and the Bioenno lithium iron phosphate batteries. Down below you'll see a graph of the overall performance, and one of the first things I will point out, the blue and the green lines are your lithium iron phosphate batteries. The red line is your AGM battery. The most striking thing to walk away from here is notice that once a heavy current is put on here, look how far the voltage drops. Instantly on the AGM battery, you're looking at about 12.25, 12.3 volts or so. Whereas the lithium iron phosphate batteries are dropping either just below 13 or maybe at about 12.6, 12.6 and a half. The other thing to note is that the discharge curve for the AGM battery is almost a line with a constant slope, whereas both the lithium iron phosphate batteries, the voltage drop is much slower over time. And then there's a sharp drop off towards the end. This is one of the reasons why using a voltage indicator is not really a good indicator of state of charge like it is with an AGM battery. So the results for this test is that at a 10 amp constant current discharge, the A123 battery was able to provide 4.485 amp hours, or 97% of its rating. It ran for a total of 27 minutes and 6 seconds. The dollar per amp hour measured would be $30.10 per amp hour, and the amp hours per measured amp hours per pound is 2.24. For the AGM battery, the total amp hours at 10 amps was 2.05, or 23% of the battery's rating. The total runtime was 12 minutes and 21 seconds. The dollar per amp hour is $12.19, and the measured amp hours divided by the weight is 0.34. This number matters because this really speaks to energy density for what you're carrying. So in other words, it's very clear in this chart that at 0.34 amp hours per pound, that's not a very good value in terms of energy density. Finally, the Bioenno battery at 10 amps provided 7.318 amp hours, or 91% of its rating. It ran for 44 minutes and 12 seconds, provides a $12.98 per amp hour, and provides 3.05 measured amp hours per pound. So the takeaway for this, and actually all of the other subsequent tests, because I present my data in the same way, is that if you're really trying to maximize the value of received amp hours per dollar, you're going to want to look for the lowest value in this column. But if you're also somebody who's very much interested in operating portably with these batteries, you may also want to include the maximum in this column. Now, the Bioenno is clearly the winner for energy density and came in second here for the cost per amp hour. One thing to be clear, to get the same running time, you would have to purchase 4 of the AGM batteries, and at $25 a piece, that would be $100, which brings us back up into this territory. The next test I ran was a 1 amp constant current test, which this would actually simulate running something like an IC-7300, a Yaesu FT-897 or 857, an Icom IC-7100 or 7000, letting it just run and receive, because those radios all draw approximately 1 amp constant current. Again, you'll notice that the voltage drop is on a fairly linear slope, as for the AGM battery. And again, notice that the voltage drop on the lithium iron phosphate batteries is much slower, with a fairly dramatic decrease at the end. So for the 1 amp constant current test, the A123 battery provided 4.75 amp hours, or 103% of its rating. It ran for a total of 4 hours and 46 minutes and 25 seconds. And in this case, the dollar per measured amp hour is $28.42. The measured amp hours per pound is 2.37. For the AGM battery, the total amp hours measured was 4.582, or 51% of its rating. The runtime was 4 hours, 36 minutes, and 20 seconds. The dollars per measured amp hour is 5.46, and the measured amp hours per pound is 0.75. The Bioenno battery provided a total of 7.675 amp hours, or 96% of its rating, providing a total runtime of 7 hours, 42 minutes, and 40 seconds, a dollars per measured amp hour of 12.38, and a measured amp hours per pound of 3.2. For the lithium iron phosphate batteries, you will notice one thing that's pretty clear. In the previous test at 10 amps, we had 4.485 and 7.3 for the A123 and the Bioenno. So when we come over here, 4.75 and 7.675. Despite the fact that the current was 10 times higher, there wasn't a dramatic difference in the total measured amp hours. That's one of the nice things about lithium iron phosphate chemistry. Whereas the AGM battery, when we went 1/10 the current, the total amp hours increased considerably. Again, this is that Peukert, and I apologize, I don't know if I'm actually pronouncing that right, but it's Peukert effect that states that for a battery, some batteries are more sensitive to the discharge current than others. Clearly, lithium iron phosphate batteries are not as sensitive to discharge. So from a runtime perspective, the Bioenno battery is clearly, again, the winner here. From an energy density perspective, the Bioenno battery is clearly the winner. But in the dollars per amp hour, once again, the AGM battery is in theory the best value. But in this case, in order to get the same amount of runtime as the Bioenno battery, I would end up having to buy 2 AGMs, which would be approximately $50 or more. For this test, I did a 1/4 amp constant current test. This would simulate running a radio such as a KX3 or a Yaesu FT-817 on receive. The A123 battery provided a total of 4.801 amp hours, or 104% of its rating, with a total runtime of 19 hours, 15 minutes, and 49 seconds. The dollars per measured amp hour are $28.12. And the measured amp hours per pound are 2.4. The AGM battery provided 5.384 amp hours, or 60% of its total rating. with a runtime of 21 hours, 33 minutes, and 35 seconds. The dollars per measured amp hour are $4.64, and the measured amp hours per pound are 0.90. The Bioenno battery provided 7.734 amp hours, or 97% of its total rating, with a runtime of 30 hours, 48 minutes, and 28 seconds. The dollars per measured amp hour are $12.28, and the measured amp hours per pound are 3.22. One thing notable about this test is that the AGM battery actually provided more total amp hours than the A123 battery at a quarter amp constant current discharge. This does imply that an AGM battery may be a better selection if you have a low current application. So for my next test, I performed duty cycle test instead of constant current test. I programmed the load to vary the load on the battery. And in this particular test, I programmed it to run a 1 amp load for 60 seconds and a 10 amp load for 30 seconds. This approximately simulates a 2-to-1 receiving and transmit load with a radio like an IC-7300, probably running at about 40-50 watts, somewhere in that range. So this was really designed to give you an idea, if you were doing a 2-to-1 listen-to-talk ratio, what your actual field time numbers would look like. You'll notice that the traces look much different, and that's because we're measuring at 2 different current levels. The peaks in all the curves would be representative of the lower current receive simulation, and the valleys would be the higher current transmit simulation. So for this particular test, the A123 battery provided a total of 4.573 amp hours, or 99% of its rating, with a total runtime of 1 hour, 9 minutes, and 10 seconds. The dollars per measured amp hour are 29.52, and the measured amp hours per pound are 2.29. For the AGM battery, a total of 2.443 amp hours were measured, or 27% of the rating. The total runtime was 37 minutes and 21 seconds. The dollars per measured amp hour were $10.23, and the measured amp hours per pound are 0.41. Finally, the Bioenno battery provided a total of 7.359 amp hours, or 92% of its rating, for a total runtime of 1 hour, 51 minutes, and 15 seconds, with a dollar per measured amp hour of $12.91, and a measured amp hour per pound of 3.07. Again, the Bioenno battery is the clear winner for total runtime, as well as energy density. For my final test, I performed another 2-to-1 receive to transmit simulation, but this time I did a 1/4 of an amp for 60 seconds to simulate receive, and 3 amps for 30 seconds to simulate transmit. This would roughly simulate the worst case scenario for an Elecraft KX3 or a Yaesu FT-817. For the A123 battery in this particular test, we measured a total of 4.717 amp hours, or 103% of the rating, a total runtime of 4 hours, 3 minutes, and 51 seconds, and a dollar per measured amp hour of $28.62, and a measured amp hour per pound of 2.36. For the AGM battery, we measured a total amp hours of 4.086, or 45% of the rating, a total runtime of 3 hours, 30 minutes, and 57 seconds, and a dollar per measured amp hour of $6.12, and a measured amp hour per pound of 0.68. The Bioenno battery was measured at 7.662 amp hours, or 96% of its rating, with a total runtime of 6 hours, 34 minutes, and 52 seconds, and a dollar per measured amp hour of $12.40, and a measured amp hour per pound of 3.19. To summarize the data, I've pulled all 5 tests worth of summary results into this single slide and then brought back the pertinent specifications of the batteries here. I want to remind folks again that each one of these tests was run until the battery hit 11.8 volts, and that was measured at the DC load, not at the battery terminals. Again, I chose this way of ending the test because most of our radios run at 13.8 volts plus or minus 15%, and that negative 15% is about 11.78, which I rounded up to 11.8. One thing I'll point out about the AGM battery is obviously the rating of the battery was 9 amp hours. We know that AGM batteries are rated at a 20-hour rate, and that tells us that that test would have been performed at 0.45 amps. Surprisingly, when we look at the 1/4 amp test, we only got 5.384 amp hours, and we're reporting that as 60%. But remember that rating of that battery is down to 10.5 volts, which is generally considered where a sealed lead acid battery is quote-unquote dead, or 100% depth of discharge. So in a lot of ways, these numbers being small, while definitely showing the Pukert effect, aren't necessarily the complete picture of the battery, because there is technically still energy to be had out of them. I just don't consider it usable for most radio purposes for the reasons that I chose 11.8 as the cutoff voltage. Similarly with the lithium iron phosphate batteries, we don't always see 100% of the rating. And first of all, I wouldn't expect 100% of the rating all the time, but also these batteries are rated at their cutoff voltage where the PCM or the protection circuitry would disconnect the battery from the load. So these tests were conducted primarily to talk about usable power capacities. I've highlighted in green the winners in each category, which for most hams, runtime is probably going to be the one we look at the most. And in every one of these cases, the Bioenno battery is the clear winner. Also, in energy density, as far as the weight versus the amount of energy I have, the Bioenno is also a clear winner. Overall, I will admit, the only thing these three batteries really have in common is their form factor. This isn't exactly an apples-to-apples test, and again, I fully admit that. But from a comparative perspective of comparing lithium iron phosphate batteries, in other words, the A123 versus the Bioenno, this is a very good test, because at the end of the day, when we as hams are looking to purchase things, we want to maximize our capacity and our capability while minimizing our cost. The Bioenno battery coming in at $95, not including the charger, $107 with the charger, already starts off significantly cheaper than the current $135 price tag on the NEC ALM-12V7. But on top of that, you have 8 amp hour rating versus what is now a 5 hour amp hour rating. So you also have significantly more energy capacity, which is why the Bioenno battery is such a good value. Of course, overall, we all know AGM batteries are significantly cheaper than the lithium iron phosphates. And of course, we see the AGM win in the dollar per measured amp hour in every category. The downside with this, of course, is that in order to match the run times or the capacities of the other batteries, you would have to buy multiple AGM batteries. And it's £6 a piece, even though that they may be a better dollar value, especially if you're considering portable, that probably doesn't make sense. I, for one, am very biased towards lithium iron phosphate because the technology keeps the voltage level higher overall, as we saw in the discharge curves, which is good for our radios. And also the sheer weight reduction is a very, very valuable property of those batteries. So I don't use AGM batteries for things anymore, except for the ones I still have. I'll pull them out occasionally. But lithium iron phosphate are my go-to batteries. I want to thank Bioenno Power again for providing me this battery. I've gotten several questions about them over the last several months, and really didn't have an opinion. I thought it was another new no-name battery company, and they were very kind to send this to me to allow me to put the battery through its paces and actually prove it out to see if it is a worthwhile contender. And going forward, based on the performance and the fact that this battery does come in at that sweet spot of under $99, this is going to be my recommendation for a small lithium iron phosphate powered battery going forward. I also look forward to seeing them at Dayton again this year to talk to them, and we'll also probably try to pick up some of their larger batteries as well. The long term, of course, I don't have a way of simulating the full lifespan of the battery, but as I use these batteries in projects and in operating, if I run into any problems, I will report back. Thank you for watching. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you have any questions or any suggestions for future tests, or if you have seen anything that you disagree with about my testing methodology, please feel free to leave comments below, and I will try to address them in the future. Thank you very much. 73.